was already said that we're competing with the, so far the sunniest and nicest day of the year. So even more, it's even more appreciated that you are here in the room, and also warm welcome to those of you who are following this meeting over Zoom. This is a further event in our ConTrust speaker series, and our speaker today is Dorothy Noyes. She is the College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of English at The Ohio State University, with a joint appointment in anthropology, French and Italian, and Germanic languages and literatures. And for almost a decade, between 2005 and 2014, Dorothy also directed the Ohio State Center for Folklore Studies. And beginning this summer, she will be the director of the Merchant Center for International Security Studies, one of the world's leading centers in international security and international relations. As you can see from this range of appointments, Dorothy is at home in many academic disciplines, a positioning that is also reflected in her publications, among them Fire in the Plaza, Catalan Festival Politics After Franco, published with University of Pennsylvania Press in 2003. Humble Theory, Folklore's Grasp on Social Life with Indiana University Press in 2016, and Sustaining Interdisciplinary Collaboration, A Guide for the Academy, a book co-authored with Regina Bendix and Kilian Bitzer, published with University of Illinois Press in 2017. Dorothy is currently a visiting fellow here at ConTrust and is helping us to, during her stay, to reflect on our own interdisciplinary practices of research. Today, however, she will be presenting parts of another project of hers with the title Exemplary Failures, Gesture and Emulation in Liberal Politics. And her talk will be based on one of the chapters of this future book. And the title of the talk is The Clemency Scenario, Trust and Scale in European Political Drama, 1787 to 1813. And I think Dorothy will be presenting for about 45 minutes, which then will leave us 45 minutes for questions and discussions. All right, it's great to have you here in Frankfurt, and great to have you as our speaker tonight in this lecture series.
This is a select and intimidating audience, and I'm very grateful to you all for coming on this beautiful day. It's a long day. Speaking for myself, I'm at a bit of the low vital ebb, so it is very possible that your eyes may gently fall shut. If they do, don't worry, but be aware there's going to be some music in the middle that will sort of spark you back into awareness. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm particularly grateful to Tobias, whom I met in this building. In fact, we think 2014, perhaps, at a conference that he and his fellow students organized. And I guess we each recognized that we were trying to figure out problems of process in politics in ways that made us useful interlocutors to one another. And so I'm very grateful to have his creativity and goodwill in some of my more excessive interdisciplinary ventures. So I was thinking about what to offer here, particularly since Christopher and Tobias have had to listen to a few too many of my songs and dances in the past. And I'm going to give you a kind of rereading of an article that I published in 2015 with a bit of methodological reflection that perhaps will offer some additional strategies for approaching both trust and conflict in action, but also the intellectual history of trust and conflict as abstrakte Begriffe. So if we're doing intellectual history well, we're already interdisciplinary, we're already going to many sources. We're looking at the history of political and legal and economic institutions. We're looking at the direct documentation of episodes of contestation through perhaps parliamentary debates, judicial records, speeches, pamphlets, protests, journalism, memoirs. We're looking at the philosophers and the theorists of the time for intellectual context. And sometimes we're looking at the arts, and usually we're looking at them for cultural meanings, for ideological framings, and as rhetorical resources for swaying public opinion. But what I want to also suggest is that the arts should be understood as their own mode of social thought, as their own mode of public reason. And I come to this through my particular disciplinary training. And so what folklorists think about is a few interconnected things. Vernacular that is informal, perspectives on the processes of life as well as marginalized ones. Everybody who is called folk, these are the people who are not admitted to full citizenship. Then, of course, we think about the residual elements of contemporary life, the cultural leftovers, whether these are things we traditionalize and celebrate a few times a year, or whether they're habitual and go under the radar. And then finally, we think about social life as really being made up of a repertoire of shared forms that we keep pushing around, circulating, rebooting, and repurposing, both in performances and in various kinds of textual and institutional reifications. So that I come to all of that, and my basic method, like that of many other fields, is ethnography. So if I want to understand a general problem like trust and conflict, I have to start with a case. And I find out the significant features of the case by trying to describe it in writing. So in a sense, it's an aesthetic process of shaping that is causing me to pull out dimensions. And this ethnographic activity is not really so different, I want to say, from the aesthetic and conceptual modeling that happens in the arts. So again, the arts, whether they're lofty or trivial, are, in my view, a mode and a kind of domain of public reasoning that is especially important for people who are not in the coffee house, or where there is no coffee house, or even because even in the best of cases, the coffee house mode of discourse is very important, but it doesn't capture everything. So talking about, of course, here, the arts that are popular rather than hermetic, that are accessible to a wide audience, even forced on them because they're happening in central public spaces that can't really be avoided. And so in this respect, we can talk about 18th century theater, but also 21st century social media. And they have a collective character insofar as they depend on multiple interacting agents to put them together. They're received by a wide swath of respondents who debate their meanings, who guide the next expressions. There is continuing activity in these arenas. The opera house needs new operas. The salon needs new paintings every year. The periodical needs new novels. So there's a kind of ongoing conversation on matters of perennial concern. I think these are all quite obvious things, but they perhaps bear saying again that even if we're talking about the 20th century avant-garde authored productions that set out to overthrow everything that has come before it, those depend on the references to what came before. So as Bakhtin and others have pointed out, no utterance is ever really new. It belongs to a network. So in my field, this is quite easy to exemplify because we look at these formulaic forms like the fairy tale, which is always the same story, but which it's colored differently to keep us paying attention, but it's also stretched in different ways. The heroine can win out because she's beautiful. She can win out because she's good. She can win out because she's clever. She can win out because she helps other people and has a helpful network. She can be opportunistic. Those are emphases that shift across time and communities, but even in one small community, different tellers are going to push the narrative and pull it in different ways. And this constitutes a kind of debate on how people in a scarce resource society are going to best manage their chances. So it's a bit, it's through the replaying of a familiar scenario, it's a little bit like game theory in the social sciences. You keep remixing the same ingredients and seeing how they come out differently. Then finally, an important feature of this traditional public sphere is that it doesn't abstract, it typifies. So folktales present the kind of thing that happens over and over in exaggerated, memorable ways. And then it's important that this is a zone of indirection, deniability, ambiguity. Again, to give you a clearer kind of example, transparency is dangerous for most people in most places in most times of history. If you're avoiding conflict in difficult surroundings, you tend to need deniability, you tend to need a bit of interpretive room for private understanding. So for example, in 2008 and 9, I was involved in a couple of conferences on ISAF's counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan. And we were astonished to discover that the British and American governments had actually hired consulting firms such as Deloitte and Touche to conduct house-to-house surveys and ask people how the occupation was going for them. Not surprisingly, the responses were reluctant and not very illuminating. But a colleague of mine, a folklorist, Margaret Mills, who had been visiting Herat since the Soviet period, just went to the bazaars and listened to the jokes people were telling. And from the jokes, she learned pretty much everything she needed to learn about the types and sources of popular mistrust. So easy to see these things in folklore, but it's not only the people we call folk who need this kind of indirect reasoning. I think every social group, and especially every complex public, needs a space of shared reflection and reasoning that lacks direct instrumental consequences, but nonetheless that allows certain things to be in the air and to be played out. So I want to show you then a case. I will take you to the neighborhood of the French Revolution, to places of late absolutist or restoration rule where ruling classes are highly concerned about the possibility of political reform and also, of course, about avoiding revolution in the process. And I will show you how they repurpose a particular dramatic formula, this scenario of princely clemency. So again, if we think about the theater in the 18th and 19th century Europe, it's a distributed space. There are court theaters, but what happens there also gets into the public theaters, also gets circulated by street singers, also gets circulated in domestic performance. And this zone of theater depends heavily on conventions. There are stock plots, stock characters, stock stage properties, all of these that are continually reworked and reformed. And so this also is a kind of public sphere, I would say, in which the highest and the lowest elements of society can see one another at some level, and to some extent at least, are put into mutual awareness, even communication. So this particular scenario, we can never give anything exact dates, but let's say that it starts with the French tragedy, with plays like Corneille's Cinna, and we could maybe put Aida as the sort of last tragic gasp of it. This begins as a Stoic scenario with Roman sources about the education of the princely hero as he's elevated to divine rule. And it's gradually infused with new forms and ideas that are coming from bourgeois drama. And again, you have the same basic ingredients that are being shaken together, which you can see not only at the level of plot, but at the level of the echoes of particular lines of text, particular scenes, and so on. So we have a kind of conflict in court endemically. The drama is prompted by the sovereign discovering that he's been betrayed by somebody below him but close to him. He has to weigh personally and institutionally, should he punish or pardon. There is a love plot intertwined with this in which he either fails to marry or his marriage fails. And through the double effects of clemency being given and marriage failing, the sovereign is elevated above the human. He's sort of pushed up to a sublime level where he's no longer in intimate relations with anybody. And the question, therefore, is what becomes of society and the state, and what becomes of the sovereign himself under stress? And the sort of larger questions played out, can power be effectively wielded or wielded at all by humans at this imperial scale, this scale that's above interpersonal knowledge and perception? and the more general question of human interests and emotions as inescapable elements in institutional process. Now, you don't talk about this at home. You have to push it away somewhere. And of course, because in this period we have both rulers and censors who are quite nervous, we have fortunately a tradition of classical and Renaissance drama allowing us to stage matters at a distance. So we have, of course, Rome as the prototype of large-scale empire and bureaucratic state. We have Spain as the sort of intimate other of the northern empires on which we project all of the disorder and violence, all of the cruelty and irrationality of large-scale rule. We can think of these as sort of subjunctive spaces where the counterfactual, the possible, the what could happen can be staged, and can be staged in this very centralized, full frontal kind of framework in which power sets itself up for evaluation. And there's also an equally important backstage where corruption and conspiracy, or we could say cheating and betrayal, building on Nicole Deidelhoff from last week, where these things hold sway. So we then have these three works that in their different ways are taking the absolutist dramatic tradition and they are infusing it with bourgeois forms. So the spoken drama of people like Lessing and Diderot, the opera buffa tradition, they are using aesthetic reformation to explore the question of political reform. And these particular texts play out the possibility of the Clemency Scenario with special vividness. So La Clemenza di Tito is, of course, composed as a court drama for the coronation of the new Holy Roman Emperor. And so this opera is written in the genre of opera seria. It's got castrati, it has very rigid conventions, but a lot of what Mozart learned doing Figaro gets infused. The musical language and the reworking of the libretto are changing quite a bit. There's a conflict between the Emperor Titus and his friend Sextus, leading a revolt to dislodge him. The question of trust here is not yet institutional. It's really about personal loyalty, fedeltà, fe. But the betrayal, it's not that anybody, it's not that people are pushing back against Tito, but it is about state power. This is the point. So betrayal, again, here I'm borrowing the term from Professor Deidelhoff to talk about betrayal of second order norms that are the grounding of a relationship, that break the relationship or potentially break it. Don Carlos, you all know better than I do, was conceived by Schiller for the New National Theatre in Mannheim, and he described it as a family portrait in a princely household, meaning that he was trying to write a bourgeois sentimental drama as it would play out under different political conditions. It is set in Spain during the period of the Black Legend. Philip II has the Grand Inquisitor behind him, and he has a confrontation with the Marquis of Posa, who is a sort of liberal avant la lettre, who incites the Prince Carlos to stand up for Flemish rebels. So here is an institutional betrayal again, in a context of personal loyalty, but especially personal corruption. Relations in the court are personal, and it's the institutions that are beginning to push their way in. And then Hugo's HERNANI is, which got lost on my page. Of course, if you've heard of this, it's not much played anymore, but this was the famous play that Hugo orchestrated all of his friends to come and yell and create a riot at, to proclaim the Romantic Revolution that would precede the 1830 overthrow of the Restoration regime. So it was written to cause a scandal. It is pushed back to the heroic moment of Charles V in Spain, and it's about the ascent of Charles V as emperor. And here the curious thing is that the new emperor has a great trust in institutions. He decides he can live without personal trust, that his universal power will be sufficient to keep things under control, whereas his courtiers and the other protagonists are entirely particularistic in their concerns. Okay. So I will show you just a little bit of how this works, because the molding of forms is what I'm trying to get at here. With La Clemenza, just in half a sec, with La Clemenza di Tito, to start with the kind of turning point of this opera, I'm going to play you a duet that Mozart introduced into the older libretto from Metastasio, and it builds on the musical inventions of his comic operas. It's what the musicologist François de Médicis calls a duet of influence. And this is a Mozartian formal invention in which two characters who are at odds learn how to understand one another. So we have here two of the noble protagonists of the opera. Annio learns that Titus is going to marry his beloved Servilia, and he's doing this to unify Roman families. Annio, feels a duty to Titus and to the state, so Annio sort of sucks it up, doesn't say anything about being in love with Servilia himself, runs into her in the palace and confuses her by suddenly treating her distantly with all kinds of respect. And so he calls her Augusta, and she says, "What the hell is happening? Explain this to me." So with words that are repeated through the opera, she says, "Stop, turn back, explain." And the duet follows. He sings first in this kind of sad voice, "I'm sorry, I really love you, forgive me for talking like this." She now, in turn taking, revises the sentiment, and because she is a soprano voice and not a male castrato, brightens the tone of it and says, "You were my first love and I will always love you." Then they start getting sort of aroused and the turn taking speeds up and they start singing quickly in dialogue, mirroring one another and ultimately singing the same tune over again in unison in a kind of ecstatic and very close sort of harmony. So there's a formal modeling of this coming together in mutual understanding through explanation. All right, now we can have it, please. So you'll see the stages of this. Okay, so in a pretty obvious way, we have look at me, remember, hear me. We have co-presence as the basis of solidarity in a way that is going to become the foundation of a good state. This is the companionate marriage of, of course, of Lessing and other sentimental drama, but co-presence, listening, turning back, explaining. There's a real emphasis on this. So all of the characters here are aristocrats because it's an opera seria, but if we look at Servilia, the woman here, and just hear her name also, based on youth and gender and vocal fach, she's the lowest status character in the opera, and she is the one who is insisting on sort of pause and explanation, and she begins the reversal of a cycle of aristocratic negative reciprocity. And I will not model the whole thing for you, but we have this kind of cycle of vengeance that has been going on through the course of the opera, and then we have it really rescued from below, first by Servilia, who then converts Annio, and the two of them together are entreating, are convincing the characters in the middle, the ones who are leading the revolt, to turn back, to think again, to change their mind, to reform their ideas. Now, what's important here is that you and I can sing this. This is music at a level that respects kind of the normal human range of the normal range of human voices. Of course, he is a castrato because of the court conventions, but very quickly, this is a character that would be sung by the same kind of woman, female voice who would sing Cherubino in Figaro. And she is the same kind of voice who would sing Susanna in Figaro. So again, the low-ranked characters, and this is a bourgeois duet. It circulates in print copies. It's very popular in England. This was Mozart's most popular opera until about 1830, when I guess its narrative was no longer plausible. But this was the most popular number of Mozart's most popular opera, as something that validated the kind of domestic music makers who were, of course, courting couples. So in the aesthetics of the late 18th century, their music is beautiful, it's tender, it's affecting, and the music of the other characters is sublime. It's virtuosic, it is unsingable, it is extreme in its force and range, and its point is not to inspire tenderness, but to inspire Bewunderung. So they then launched this change through, again, these recurrent injunctions to communicate. And through this, there's a kind of widening of a virtuous circle that eventually reforms everybody in the opera. And Tito himself has really nothing to do with this. He just watches from above and sings. Once Servilia goes to him and says, you know, I will marry you for the sake of the empire, but I think you need to know, you know, that I was betrothed to Annio. He says, oh, if only every heart were so sincere, then to rule would not be a torment. So he has a kind of gratitude. So we have a happy ending. The conspirators repent, they're forgiven, the empire is secured, the right couples are married off. It's all great, except that Tito himself is set apart from all of this by being lifted above it. And as the opera opens, I don't know how many of you actually know it or have seen it, but as it opens, he has just come out of the end of another drama. He has just sent off the Jewish princess Berenice back to Palestine for the good of the empire, and he's decided he has to marry a Roman woman for the sake of the nobility. So he has already been sublimating his feelings, and he's already complaining about his troublesome heart that has to find expression somewhere. So friendship is going to be his sort of rescue. And when his friend betrays him because he's in love with the woman who wants to be empress, he has a kind of human impulse of revenge. And he's wrestling with that, but also wrestling with his own fame as the Clement hero. And the opera shows this as a kind of psychological compulsion, a little bit of a mania to forgive that he turns into something politically useful by turning this human heart into a heart for humanity. And you know, you can think of Frederick the Great, this as a new feature of the ruler of the period. So let's play the next thing in a more modern production where you begin to see the stress. Sesto now has just confessed his guilt and he's been carried off, and Tito is venting his feelings in a recitative. It's a real retreat into his sort of processional and rigid kind of role. But the language is, if to impero, that is, if to rule, a severe heart is necessary, then take away my power or give me a different heart. And so it's about how to become a modern monarch who has to have heart for humanity, but cannot find a vent for the human. And the critical line in it is he's addressing amici dei, friends the gods, because he no longer has a friend in Sesto. He is only able to talk to the gods. So he's pushed up in this place where he is entirely left to himself and pushed into these kinds of reactionary forms. So at the end of the and I'm sorry, this is the last one. So at the end, he's already decided he's going to forgive Sesto, and then he finds out that Vitellia, who he was going to make queen, has betrayed him. We have a glorious finish, again, in the most processional, the most old-fashioned kind of, that's it for the videos, thank you, the most old-fashioned kind of musical idiom. So he has moved totally into a realm of abstraction. The gods are warring with him. They, perfidy is warring with clemency. He is up at a level where he cannot connect to the human anymore. And in the process, and he's being recognized by the other characters as such, as sublime. So the two women singing, the translation was not great, but they're singing, "Oh generous, oh great, whoever rose to so much. My eyes are filled with tears," and that sounds like a good sentimental thing, but it's not, by what a great guy you are. It's by your Eccelsa, like glory in excelsis, your supreme goodness. So they are looking up in Bewunderung at somebody who has moved totally out of their level. Okay, so what's going to be the outcome of that declaration that Titus makes? Let it be known at Rome that I am the same, that I know everything, absolve everything, and forget everything. This is one of the famous lines that reworked from Corneille, but in an opera that's very insistent on attention and looking and particular learning and consideration, I forget everything is something that might want to worry us a little bit. And modern productions, as we see here, take up the emphasis on the psychological cost. How long can Tito become a god? Sustain being a god with a heart for humanity. We see him kind of cracking up. So the later texts, and I will just briefly mention each of them, follow on these two sort of questions: the future of the empire and the future of the sovereign himself. So first, with Don Carlos, which is written originally in the mid-1780s, just as Kant is publishing the Grundlegung. And the dilemmas of the play are, in a sense, all about the second formulation of the...
Just the one.
Yeah, okay.
No, perfect.
Okay. Are really about the second formulation of the categorical imperative. There's a whole lot of discussion of what it means to use men and whether they can be used as a means to a higher end. And the sovereign Philip and his son Don Carlos are torn between two different political zealots who in different ways both want to use particular individuals and actually the qualities of humanity as means to political ends. So again, we have a court that's governed by passion and favor and negative reciprocity, and Philip plays this game but despises it. As in Tito, we have a nucleus of good characters that bear the new values. They believe in tears and Mitgefühl and friendship and this kind of thing. But the Marquis of Posa, the liberal hero, sees this sentimental feeling as a means to an end. He sees that friendship is a stepping stone. He urges Prince Carlos to sublimate his love for the Queen into a passion for saving humanity, rescuing the suffering Flemish who are under Spanish tyranny. When he speaks to Philip, who wants to make a friend of him and wants to make him his particular confidant, he says, "I'm not the boyhood friend of your son. I am a deputy of all humanity." And so when Posa betrays him, Philip freaks out in a very human way with this very famous line, "Der König hat geweint," which is not what a divine ruler is supposed to be doing. And Philip scales up his rage in this very terrifying but concrete vision of where empire is going to go. "Die Welt ist noch auf einen Abend mein. Ich will ihn nützen diesen Abend, dass nach mir kein Pflanzer mehr in zehn Menschen altern auf dieser Brandstadt ernten soll. Er brachte der Menschheit seinem Götzen, mich zum Opfer. Die Menschheit büße mich für ihn." So he is taking revenge, at absolutely cosmic scale, but he's not a man for, abstracte Begriffe. We're talking about the auto da fe. So there's a certain history of the world in this passage about what happens when the human gets too much scope in the context of personalistic rule. However, Philip has somebody above him, and that's the Grand Inquisitor. You all read this in school, I'm sure, so you all know it better than I do, but the Inquisitor encourages him to take vengeance on his son, not because he might be having an affair with the queen, but because Carlos poses a danger to empire. And he puts this in very statistical terms. If you pardon one man, by what right can you kill 10,000? It sounds absolutely Stalinist. The Inquisitor is a rationalist, and he tries to teach Philip that he's not allowed human feeling. Men for you should be numbers. But he takes advantage of Philip's tyrannical side. So again, the negative human qualities are a stepping stone to more efficient rule. Philip can't handle it. Philip is content to condemn Carlos, but when the Inquisitor insists that Posa has to be sacrificed, Philip tries to rebel, but the institution is stronger than he is. And so he ultimately, the emperor on whom the sun never sets, says to the Inquisitor, "Ich bin ein kleiner Mensch," and simply surrenders himself to the efficiency of a police state. So humanity here is sort of snuffed out altogether. Quite different, a sort of opposite solution is what happens in HERNANI, where again, on the brink of this bourgeois revolution, Hugo puts forward a very picturesque plot of Spanish love and honor that is really past its sell-by date, and it's really pure distraction. The real drama here is again the Stoic plot of the education of a ruler, and it's about the young Charles, King of Spain, as he is about to become Emperor Charles V. And in this play, he bears a rather conspicuous resemblance to Napoleon. So Charles, here we have a bigger social world in the play. We've got a court society that is venal and contemptible, and then we have this plot going off in the provinces, up in the mountains of Navarre, where there's a group of old feudal nobles who are absolutely stuck in the honor code. They've got love and revenge and family hatreds, and they are just too stupid and too obstinate to get themselves out of it. So there's a love triangle of the hero, who's a nobleman turned outlaw, and the heroine and her guardian, and King Charles walks into this somewhat by accident and falls in love with the heroine. So he abducts the heroine, the hero comes to rescue her, the plot is discovered, and Charles, and this all happens in Aachen as the election to emperor is about to happen, and Charles rises to empire by renouncing predation, renouncing vengeance, and renouncing love. So he gives clemency to HERNANI for his family's rebellion. He gives him a title, he gives him the golden fleece, he gives him the heroine, because on the verge of the imperial election, he has spent a night in the tomb of Charlemagne, communing with the emperor to come to terms with what his future is. And so the 19-year-old Charles says, "Extinguish yourself, young heart. From now on, your loves, alas, your mistresses will be Flanders, will be Germany, will be Spain." This is a little bit uncomfortable given that he had abducted the heroine and was planning to rape her. And we remember what's going to happen to Flanders because we've all seen Don Carlos. But at any rate, we have just as in the other plays, we have a great finale to Act 4, where Charles gives this clemency, a kind of transformation is announced, everybody is just amazed. HERNANI says, "Who has changed us like this?" And everyone shouts, "Gloria Carlos," and we live happily ever after, except that there's an Act 5. So Charles is off conquering somewhere. Charles is now everywhere and nowhere. He's emperor. We never see him again. And the court goes back to its old corruption, and back in the provinces, the heroine's old guardian still wants Hernani to fulfill his oath of a duel, and he interrupts the wedding night, and the couple have actually 10 minutes left to make love, but the heroine keeps talking, so the horn blows and everybody dies. And it's all very, you know, romantic and absurd. But the point is that nobody except Charles has actually learned anything. Again, as with Tito, there's a whole lot of language about learning and understanding versus the knee-jerk reactions of the honor code of the old negative reciprocity. So the point here is that without this continuing, you know, Charles can come in and transform everybody, but it will not stick without the continuing interaction, without his continuing presence. If the institutional layer goes up here and the human layer goes down here, then we have backsliding. So corruption at the center comes back, and this just suicidal kind of involution at the periphery continues. So we have a widening gap, and if I were clever with PowerPoint, I would show you a kind of widening gap where we have Tito sort of launched up above the human, but still with a heart for humanity, still trying to connect down here to the level of the nation and to support this sort of interpersonal positive stuff that's happening. With Don Carlos, we have a firmer split happening. The characters in the middle, Posa and the other good characters, refuse the elevation and they try to descend to suffering humanity, and they die along with it. Philip fails to jump up to upscale himself, you could say, but with the Grand Inquisitor's sort of instigation, the vengeance and the jealousy at the personal level are taken up to the statistical scale. And then in HERNANI, we have a complete disconnection between the scale of rule, the scale of empire or sovereignty, and the human scale, where at the interpersonal level, people go back to what they were, and at the level of nations, they suffer what they must. So translating this into more modern terms, to come back to trust, we can see Clemenza as almost anticipating a certain, or as coalescing a certain kind of emerging liberal ideal, that there's a mutual reinforcement of personal and individual trust, personal and institutional trust. And on the one hand, you have rule of law, but below that, you have friendship, marriage, you have human connections that give the law some reality and feeling. Going over to the option that's played out in Don Carlos, we really see the totalitarian future where trust, we simply live without it. Instead, we have surveillance as thorough as possible, and this might limit cheating, maybe limit betrayal, but you end up having a kind of perversion of the institution. It may be for the sake of Catholicism, but it turns into something that's just about power. And then on the other side, we have what our authoritarian friends would do, how they would describe our own situation, liberal decadence, where there is inattention on the part of, there's an inattention of power that in some cases trusts too much the privileged actors and perhaps keeps other actors outside of that circle of trust, but makes cheating possible, petty corruption, nobody's really watching you, and also makes betrayal feasible. The institutions also can be hollowed out and co-opted, and you end up having discredit of both the persons and the institutions, and a gradual move from generalized trust to generalized distrust. So there's a kind of anticipation that is, I think, already being modeled in quite precise ways in these early dramas. And so just to conclude then, with the value of these scenarios, these sets of ingredients that are replayed over and over again under varying circumstances, I think there is a kind of cumulative diagnosis of a structural tension that plays out scenarios of its possible development. And in some ways, it is quite predictive. The kinds of things represented here are the kinds of things that have happened later in history. We have a realm of forms that are residual, or, you know, they're old-fashioned kinds of operas, or they're fictional, you know, this didn't really happen, it's just a story, or they're trivialized, come on, Spanish honor all over again. These public forms that we might not take very seriously end up providing safe spaces for reflections that are dangerous, that you really could not have among quite so wide a circle in a more open fashion. And so with this, I think, can come down and look at popular culture as a kind of early warning system that we should not neglect. Because I think before we're able to articulate social emergences, we can sing them, we can model them. They can, in the sensible forms of culture, they can take shape. So, you know, Wittgenstein's famous dictum, you know, worüber man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. There's a middle possibility there that takes place, I think, in this cultural modeling. So I will stop with that. Thank you for your patience.